All right, I think we'll get started. I'd first like to I'll first start by introducing myself. My name is Lauran Hartley, and I serve as the director of the Modern Tibetan Studies program here at Columbia University. I'd like to thank the Weatherhead East Asian Institute for providing support for this event. They, in fact, have helped us form a speaker series this fall. We decided to wrap your talk into a series that's focused on cultural production in the Tibetan diaspora. Today we'll talk about literature. On October 25th, we'll talk about journalism in the diaspora with Pema Tso, editor of the Tibet Times. And then on November 1st, we have a group of Tibetan business owners from Ladakh and northern Nepal who will be here for a roundtable on Tibetan entrepreneurship in the diaspora. So I'd like to say it is my honor to welcome Bhuchung D Sonam here today to Columbia campus. With regrets to the tight access on campus, only Columbia ID holders are able to access on campus, and yet we still have a really great turnout, and thank you for showing up today. And for those of you online as well, welcome and thanks for joining. I thought I'll start by reading the speaker's bio so you can get to know Bhuchung Sonam's work, and then he'll also be adding more details, I think, in the tonight in our conversation. Bhuchung D Sonam is an exile Tibetan poet, writer, translator, and publisher. You're based in Dharamsala primarily. His books, of which I understand about 9 publications or more, include Songs from Dewa Chen, Songs of the Arrow, Yak Horns, subtitle Notes on Contemporary Tibetan Writing, Music, Film, and Politics. He has also edited a book that I own, Muses in Exile, an anthology of Tibetan poetry, and has compiled and translated, more recently, Burning the Sun's Braids, New Poetry from Tibet. He is prolific in his work. He is a founding member and editor of Tibet Writes, which I understand is in its 20th year or so. It's fantastic, congratulations. And its imprint, Black Neck Books. So while they have the online version, they also have now a print publication, publishing house, which promotes and publishes the creative works of Tibetans. Bhuchung D Sonam's writings are published in the Washington Post, the Journal of Indian Literature, Asahi Weekly, the journal Himal, South Asian and Hindustan Times, among others. In June 2022, he was awarded the Ostana Prize Youth Award in the category of Writings in Mother Tongue for his literary contributions. He has taken part in the Bangalore Poetry Festival, the Sahit Yotsav 2023, a festival of letters, and this year, the Jaipur Literature Festival. That's a really big deal. Yes, so we are very pleased to have you here. Our format, usually we do more of a presentation, as many of you know. We have more a presentation and then discussion. But tonight we'd like to have a combination of some presentation, discussion between you and I, some literary reading, if you would read from your works. And then the whole entire second half will just open up to Q&A, people online. If you're online, please put your questions into the Q&A, and then we'll also here, and Nordzen will help with the microphone. Make sure you speak into the mic when you ask your questions. So, to get us started, I was really moved in preparing for tonight by your introduction to Muses in Exile. And while probably many people on the call and here in the room are familiar with the Tibetan exile situation, I've wondered if you might just read these first 5 or so paragraphs to kind of remind us of the context in which we're speaking tonight, and the issues, and just bring us together through your writing, if you would, these 5 paragraphs.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Thank you very much. Thank you, Lauran and my friend Pandegel, who has put this event together. And also thank you all my friends for coming, and also people who are watching online. This book was published exactly 20 years ago, 2004. So whatever I wrote was when I was much younger, with a less wrinkle and less other things. So exile is the shifting sense of hope mingled with the crippling sorrow of estrangement. When hope fades into distant horizon and only the pangs of displacement remains, exile becomes a hollow existence hanging upon a thin thread of moral courage. Exile is, in many ways, an opportunity and a severe test of communal fortitude. In spite of upheavals and separations, deaths and destructions in our homeland, we have withstood this testing period and emerged enriched. In the last 4 decades, we have established a government in exile and achieved almost full-fledged democracy. The Tibetan diaspora has become a force to be reckoned with. Nevertheless, exile reminds us that our political status is ambiguous, that we float in a parto of statelessness. Like all exiles, Tibetans too were driven to a state of homelessness by harsh circumstances. Yet, though physically deprived of home, Tibetans are not bereft within. Our strong traditional heritage and spiritual ethics guide us through a tangled web of political chaos, physical dislocation, and existential uncertainty. Our struggle to reroute ourselves under thorny circumstances is a variegated canvas. Exile Tibet binds 3 generations, those who were born and grew up in independent Tibet and chased into exiles after 1959, those who were born amidst the political upheavals of the communist Chinese takeover of the 1950s and 60s, and then came into exile at tender age, and those who were born in exile. In that time span, we have witnessed a complete revision of our social political structure. One of exile's positive changes was the increased access to education, and as a result of this new wave of intellectual fervor that is flourishing.
So I thought, would you, if you'd be willing, could you share your story of how it is that you ended up in exile? You mentioned the 3 groups of exiles. Where are you in that typology? And then just tell us the story of how it is that you ended up in exile.
You know, Mao died on September 9th, 1976, and he appointed a very mild, uncharismatic leader called Huo Guofeng as his successor, and it was reportedly said that after Huo accepted to be the successor of Mao, Mao said that with you in charge, I'm at ease. But of course, by 1977, Deng Xiaoping took over power of the Chinese political leadership, and he initiated what was called the policy relaxation, economic reforms, which also led to opening of space between exile and Tibetans under Chinese occupation. So by 1979, exiled Tibetan government sent first fact-finding delegation to Tibet, and they had a lot of exchanges with the Chinese government. So that led to opening of border between Tibet, inside Tibet, and exiled Tibet. Those who were exiled in the 1950s could come back to Tibet and visit their family members, and many Tibetans from inside Tibet could go and have audience with His Holiness Dalai Lama and visit monasteries that were set up in exile. So I was one of those people who were brought out or sent out. I was born in a very small village, so my parents had no idea about border and documents and visa and all of that. So my father told me, let's walk. So we walked for many days, and when we came to Nepal-Tibet border, we were asked to produce documents. And my father had no idea what these documents were. So that's, and then we, of course, did all that juggling, and then in, eventually we made it to Tibet. Not we, my father had to stay back, and I made it to Nepal, and eventually to India. So that was 42 years ago, 15,330 days that I haven't seen my parents. So that's how long it has been since I came into exile.
Save me the math. What year would that have been?
Sorry?
What year was that?
That was 1980, late 1980, early 1983, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you said your father stayed behind and you went on to Nepal. How old were you at that time?
I was about 10 and a half, although I didn't know exactly when I was born. And I had, along with me was my cousin brother who was 4.5 probably. And there was another kid who was even younger, maybe 3.
Was there an adult with you?
It's a very complicated thing because my father, since we couldn't get across the border with the group, he spoke with one of the Tibetan monks who was living in Kathmandu at the time. And then monk accepted to take us, given that we crossed the border by ourselves. So me and 3 kids, we just kind of walked across the border dressed as Nepalese children. And then, yeah, for half a day we walked by ourselves. And then the monk came later and he took us to Nepal.
Do you have clear, I mean, you were 10 and a half years old at that time. Do you have a clear, or ish, as far as you know, do you have a clear memory of that time and of any certain details in your mind and your feelings at that time?
I remember the day Mao died very clearly. I was about 4. And during Cultural Revolution, everyone who was from 8 to 6, they had to work every day. So when I was very young, I never used to see people in our house. Everybody would go for work. So one day, my parents came to work from early, and then they said someone died, and they were supposed to go to another village for the official mourning ceremony. And then they came back with a black armband.
For mourning.
Yeah. And the next day, because those days were terrible days, and like economic conditions were really bad. So my pants were all torn from here to here. So the next day, my father cut the black band into half and put it on my bottom. So that's how I remember Mao's death. Yeah.
Good thing
And
nobody knew that.
From the travel into exile, I remember for lunch that monk gave us noodles with the green onions. And I couldn't take the green onion. And so in the bus, I made a mess.
Oh,
So that's what I remember.
okay, that's the bus from the border,
Yeah.
like Tatopani down to
Yeah.
Kathmandu. And so, do you recall how you felt at the time as you were
I
taking
didn't
that bus?
really feel the gravity of the separation then, because I didn't know for the fact that I would never see. Strangely, then about 5 days later, my father and others also made it across the border. So when we were in Gaya, then they came. So we met one last time. Then he went back. Yeah, that was the last time I saw him.
Gaya being Bodh Gaya? No.
Bodh Gaya, yes.
Okay. And you said you're from a small village in Tibet. Would you be able to say the region? Do you mind giving us some detail that way?
Central Tibet, called Chang, Rinpoche. Rinpoche is known for its monastery built by the 14th century Tibetan mystic and social engineer Thongdong Gelbo, who also founded Tibetan opera. So there's a monastery monastery on the hill, which was absolutely destroyed by the time I was old enough to remember. And there was also a 13-story stupa that was also destroyed. Yeah, so our village then had 360 people. And I remember because Brahmaputra river runs just next to our house. So every time when I went to the toilet, I would hear, the river flowing by. So these are some of the memories that I have.
So that being the Yarlung, right? The Tsongbo River,
Yarlung Tsongbo,
that
yes.
becomes the Brahmaputra.
Eventually it becomes Brahmaputra, yes.
And was your village a largely agricultural area or nomadic? as you recall?
Kind of, you could say semi-nomadic.
Semi-nomadic. And were you far from Lhasa? Do you recall that you ever went to Lhasa before you
No,
came into exile? Or
I remember my parents going to Ngamring, which was the Zong district. I faintly remember saying something about somebody being shot. You know, those days during Cultural Revolution, you have public executions, and then they would force people from many different places to come and watch the specters. I remember something like that, but I've never been to any big towns in Tibet.
and have you ever been able to go back? You said you didn't see your family, so it sounds like not. You have a poem in this book. I was wondering if you might be willing to read that for us. I also found this particularly moving, and yeah.
Yeah, maybe because now that we have spoken about exile, there's another poem which I normally read. So it's a short one, I'll read it. Is that okay?
Oh, yeah,
For this,
sure,
yeah.
of
So,
course, yes.
you know, exile, banishment, that's what my life is all about. That's what Tibetans living in exile is by and large all about. No matter how successful you are in terms of economic, how much money you acquire, but still you have that emptiness, dislocation, loneliness, a lot of frustration. So this poem is called The Banishment. Away from home, I live in my 36th rented room with a trapped bee and a three-legged spider. The spider crawls on the wall and I on the floor. The bee bangs at the window and I on the table. Often we stare at each other, sharing our pool of loneliness. They paint the wall with the droppings and webs. I give them isolated words. Net, maze, tangle, wings, buds, flutter. Away from home, my minutes are hours. The spider travels from the window to the ceiling. The bee flies from the window to the bin. I stare out of the window. Neither speaks each other's tongue. I wish you would go deaf before my silence. Thank you. This was written many, many, many years ago. Perhaps before many of you were born. I haven't seen this poem for at least 10, 15 years. You show me just 45 minutes ago.
Right in the office,
Yeah,
I said I was going to
generally
ask you to
don't-
read that one.
Yeah, don't try to visit poems that I publish
You don't revisit
unless
your
I have to
poems.
talk about them. So this is, I'm seeing this for the first time after over a decade. So,
Oh, we'll have you read many more also.
Song of an Old Tibetan. I sing for all things dead and alive, for all things moving and still, for all moms who cry for the faraway sons, for dear moms who laugh with the nearby daughters. I sing for all fathers, strict watchdogs, for their scared, craving maidens, and the young men for their fathomless passion for flesh. I sing for my compatriots, the kindred souls, restless spirits. I sing for the young buds, for the struggle to be full-fledged flowers, for flowers that age with the honeybees, for butterflies and the colorful wings, green grasshoppers for their ceaseless hops. I sing for myself, the traveler, the ever-wandering vagabond, chased from where I belong, eluded by promises and hopes, belonging to a wounded diaspora that fights from atop a beautiful hill, and for all travelers with no destination, for all fights fought and yet to fight, for the lost caught unfound, for the trial that rises upward, for the revised spirit, for gentler heart, for the promised land, the snow-sung upland, closer to where I want to die.
That poem caught my attention. In some ways, I felt that it had a bit of the cadence of a more traditional Tibetan poem. It has that kind of song quality to it. And I wondered if you might talk about your own, degree of schooling and learning of traditional Tibetan poetry or classical poetry. And does that have any influence, do you feel, in your work, or has it at any, you've been writing now for many years. Did that ever influence your writing?
Probably. And also, I've never studied literature. I studied economics for 5 years, so I'm economic master. Nothing to do with the literature. Because I write, because I feel that things are pushing from inside, that things that push, especially poetry, it comes in such a strong force that you have to write or you have to sing. Otherwise, it bothers you so much, right? And also, as you were saying earlier, the first book that I read, I think, was Ling Kesar, Holding You Ye. Kesar had certain, Lu ala thala thala re thala mo lu yi len lu mi nga da nga mo ma shen na. So it has its own cadence, it has flow, rhythm. And sometimes because Kesar is all about, strength and, war and, hero, and so it has own cadence, right? Then one of my favorite Tibetan literature is Milarepa. Milarepa was a early 11th century Tibetan yogi and mystic, and also black magician who killed many people. So it was a very complicated character, but of course he sang this 100,000 songs, which is available in English as well, although it's compared to the original Tibetan, it's not that great. But I think, so I have all of these influences. Then also I like, Sixth Dalai Lama. His style of writing is very simple also, that comes from amidst life itself, I think. So I think, and that in my own experience, because I never studied traditional, English literature and style and, literary theory and rhythm and all of that. So I don't really know. Once, I was doing a reading at a Tibetan refugee school, and one boy got up and asked me, "You use a lot of alliteration?
Alliteration, yeah.
Alliteration, yeah. You use a lot of alliteration in your words. Can you tell me what is the technique?" And I didn't know what this word means, alliteration. Even though I don't really know. So I think it's because I read and I write, and some kind of pattern forms. But I don't know. Like it's because you're a reader, so you see some kind of pattern. But I don't write thinking that, okay, today I'm going to take my writing this way or that way. I just write because I need to write.
Could you talk about how you mentioned the Mgur style of Milarepa and the Mgur boom, and then the Alu, normally they would say that's the Sixth Dalai Lama, you pointed to his works.
Yeah.
Those are both known to be more folk, sort of a folk base, not a very ornate Sanskrit influenced or inflected poetry. How did you learn those growing up? I mean, you were 11 when you came out. Could you talk about how you learned traditional Tibetan verse? And then when did you first start writing yourself and think, oh, you felt moved to write?
My grandfather was the last abbot of the monastery that I spoke earlier. So after Chinese occupation, he was made the village shepherd, community shepherd. So every morning he would take the village sheep and goats up the mountain. And he often used to take me with him. And away from all the chaos that were happening in the village, he would teach me writing on the big boulders, Tibetan characters. And that's how I learned to read, not write. So that's how I think I read that Kesar story when I was about 9.5 maybe. So my reading ability was quite good, even before I came into exile. Then I went to Tibetan refugee school, like some of you, where I was taught, the traditional, style of writing. Dandin's Mirror of Poetry, as you know very well. Dandin's Mirror of Poetry was translated into Tibetan. Some part was translated into Tibetan in the early 13th century, but the entire text was translated into Tibetan in the late 13th century by Tibetan translator Shongden Dorji Gyaltsen. So this fundamentally influenced Tibetan way of writing. Dandin's Mirror of Poetry, when we look at it, it's just a literary theory telling people how to write good poetry. Based on that, Miller Rivers poetry is zero, I think. So, but I think I learned all of this, different gains, mirror of poetry when I was in school. So
The gyen or the ornamentation of the
ornamentation and,
kavya.
metaphors and similes and all of that,
You learned that in school at TCV?
The TCV, yeah.
At
Part of
TCV.
it was taught as a syllabus. Yeah.
How old were you when you left TCV?
I was in school for 9 years, so maybe about 18, 19.
Okay.
Yeah.
When did you yourself think to write? Were you called to write poetry in school, or when did you feel moved to begin writing your own work?
When I was in school, I used to write because some part of it was also classwork. In Tibetan homework, sometimes teacher would ask and say, "Okay, you write for mirror poetry. They'll take a certain part and say you write example for this and that." So that's how I started writing. But I was by and large inspired by Sixth Dalai Lama's poetry. Very easy, very easy to read, very easy to write. So that's how I started writing. But then I went to studied economics in the Indian University, and all of a sudden, there were 35,000 Indian students and six of us Tibetans. Then all of a sudden I thought, how would I make an impact? How could I make my story to be read by a larger audience? And only then I started writing in English.
Oh,
After I went to college.
was that in Delhi or?
No, that was in Ahmedabad.
Okay. Do you draw a connection between your earlier reading and writing, and now that's when you started writing in English, you said, to have a wider impact? Could you just talk about language? Do you continue to write in Tibetan as well, or primarily English?
It's very strange because the entire struggle for Tibet's freedom is, of course, for freedom for Tibet. But it's also, in many ways, struggle to preserve our culture, language, and way of life. But the fact that people like us, my identity as a writer, translator, primarily comes from the fact that I write and publish in English. So it's a very strange contradiction, the fact that I must preserve my language. But at the same time, I'm in many ways forced to write in a language that is not my own. My Tibetan probably is a little better than my English, and I feel far more comfortable speaking in Tibetan than English, because I don't have to then translate and think in Tibetan and then kind of translate.
Why do you, and you feel forced to write in English because of what?
Yeah, because I want my story to be known. I don't want to be forgotten. I think it's a very important thing, because when you have to fight for freedom, narrative is also really important, because for a really long time, Tibet had been written about by and large by Christian missionaries and then diplomats, and then, so it is only in the last 65 years that we have started telling our own stories in a language that is comfortable to us, and how we feel exile as we experience it every day. So I think that this experience and this expression is really important to make sure that we are understood as human beings more than as probably as Buddhist or compassionate Buddhist. which is sometimes can be a misleading perception. I get this question very often. Say, you Tibetan, oh, so you're Buddhist. So are you a practicing Buddhist? So I find this very strange because coming from my tradition, if you are a Buddhist, you are a practicing Buddhist. There's no such thing as Buddhist and then not practicing Buddhist. So for us, it's a very strange thing. But the outsiders, by and large, asking me whether I am a Buddhist and practicing Buddhism comes from the perception largely because Buddhism has fundamental impact and influence in the Tibetan civilization in the last 1300 years. And much of what world knows is primarily from that prism.
Through the prism of Buddhism,
Yeah,
or
exactly.
this focus, seeing
Yeah, but-
Tibet through Buddhism in a
Yes,
sense, or people.
but- But sometimes the problem is, we also, Tibet is not just one shade. It has many different colors and many different nuances. And one of them, of course, is people's experience, lived experience. And that sometimes doesn't come forward. And that is, I think, important. That's why I write in English and also in Tibetan. And maybe if I add maybe a few more sentences also, it's very strange that the fact that I learned my mother tongue, of course, acquired Tibetan as naturally, that's my mother tongue. And I have to learn English. I had to learn English after I came into exile. I had no choice. That's for survival. So everything that I write in English is somehow dark and, sad and melancholic, and things that I write in Tibetan are far more lighter, So I had a reading with the Tibetan audience many years ago, and I read in Tibetan and then I read in English. And every time I read in Tibetan, they would laugh and say, ha, 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 it's funny. And then I switch to English and everybody was like,
So,
so I don't know whether it has something to do with the circumstances, or I don't know. I don't know, but that's the thing that I noticed, at least with the audience.
yeah. I'm actually tempted to ask you if you have a Tibetan poem that you might want to read, and any other poem that you've brought with you that reflects, sort of addresses what you've just been speaking about. Something you'd like to read, and then we'll switch to the topic of home. We'll return to the topic of home and exile.
Yes. Now this poem is an imaginary conversation, and it has much to do with some of the memories that I shared earlier about my life in Tibet.
Great, thank you. With the title.
The title of the poem is When Was I Born? Mother, when was I born? In the year the river dried. When was that? That was the year when crops failed and we went hungry for many days. We feared that you would never survive. Was that the year we moved to a new house? That was the year when they confiscated our house and divided it among the patriotic party members. We were banished to the cowshed where you were born. When was that? That was the year when they destroyed the monastery, melted all the bronze images to make bullets. You were born when dust filled the sky. Was that the year Grandpa went away? That was the year when they sent your grandfather to prison, where he cleaned shit and butchered insects in the field. You were born when there were no men in our house. Was I born in the year the walls were pulled down? That was the year when they ripped apart the prayer hall. Wooden beams were hammered to splinters and frescoes soiled. You were born when the crazy wind blew from the east. When was that? That was the year when they burned scriptures in the village square and sang revolutionary songs in praise of the party. You were born when blades of grass refused to grow. Was that the year you stopped singing? That was the year when they took our neighbor to the hard labor camp when she sang a traditional song while digging a canal. You were born when people disappeared, one after another. When was that? That was the year when they wrote that big red slogan on the wall, Heads that stick out will be hammered down. You were born when the sun shied away from our sky. When was that? That was the year when your father.
I hear in that poem, I mean, obviously it's how to say, tracking history or relaying those tragic events, right, over time. And I also hear the voice of a child wanting to know themselves and inquiring about themselves, right? I hear that, the child asking about their origins, obviously in the poem. Could you talk about your connection, I guess your efforts to connect with home, explore this idea of home, and over time, a number of my things are coming to my mind, but how do you relate to home and to your family, your family in Tibet? And I don't know if recently WeChat has been cut off. Maybe you aren't able to have direct contact as much. Maybe you could talk about that. So I guess over the years, how has your relationship to home, your self-discovery, your relationship to family, how has that sort of changed over time, and your sense of home and where you are, I guess, who you are?
Oh, that's a big question.
It's a lot. You can choose any of it.
I think it was Simon Weil, the French philosopher, who said that being rooted is one of the most fundamental elements of human beings, but one of the most neglected ones. You realize this only when you are not rooted, when you are uprooted. For an American, probably it's far much easier to define the idea of home. You can exactly pinpoint to a place and say, this is my home. Whereas for us, and particularly for young Tibetans who are born in exile, I think the idea of home becomes really complicated in many ways, because where do you call home when your entire root is cut off, when you don't have daily access to your culture or language or other things? So that I think so, and also when you are rooted in a place and then you have sense of security, sense of freedom, and also sense of belonging. And exile denies and steals all of these. So when you are uprooted, you lose all of this sense of security, sense of rootedness, sense of freedom. But for me personally, I think because I know exactly where I was born, I know the village, I know the places. So for me, at least I have a kind of a root to say, I know where my home is. Although I lived there only for the first 10 years of my life. So that is one part of it. Then the other thing is, now if I close my eyes and imagine what my home will be, that will be only fabrication of my mind. The place that I know as a home no longer exists, I think. It, I think, has changed fundamentally, both in terms of, environment and other things. So I think it's a very complicated one, I think, because I've asked many of my friends what home means to them. And some say very easily, home is where your heart is. But where is your heart? How can you root your heart and the sense of self in a place or in a culture when you don't really have a culture in? And also, we call ourselves refugees politically, but we are not technically refugees. We are people. We are called the stateless people. So how do you again try to assert yourself in a circumstances where even you don't have a legal definition? So it can be really complicated in many ways.
It reminds me of conversations I've had recently with Tibetan entrepreneurs who maybe can't own a business or own land, right, because of their status in India. You've talked about cultural dislocation. These are some phrases you used. And when we asked for your sort of a summary of what you'd be talking about, if you don't mind, I'll quote yourself back to you. And I think it relates on this topic. Could you say more? You ask, you say through their work, both in English or Tibetan, that Tibetan writers are examining the idea of home, cultural dislocation, and their sense of self. Is home simply an imagined aspiration or a concrete space to fight for?
Yeah, I think everything that we do and think and act is ultimately geared towards that we should have a country of our own. Because no matter how hard you try to revive yourself in somebody else's place, because culture has much to do with the time and place where you live or where you base. So I think we can say we are preserving Tibetan culture in exile, but that culture is an evolution of a culture that we knew, right? Culture evolves, of course, but then so especially for writers or artists, the power and the freedom and more importantly, I think honesty with which we do this, I think is important because politicians might say something and do something, so you have problem, right? Religious leaders also same, you have other things, but for artists we do it honestly, and that becomes a basis for others to think and to imagine. Like, Sonam talks about millions of homeland, a million homeland. You can a Tibetan living here may have an idea of Tibet based on his or her own experience, her own surrounding, in her own circumstances. But that may not exactly be what I think about as homeland. But ultimately, what we are trying to, all of these different forces come together so that we have a homeland. I think that in this enterprise where we are scattered over 30 different countries, art and intellectual exercise and writing and artist creative expressions play really important because we have to stay connected. We may be everywhere, but the only viable way is to intellectually and artistically, creatively stay connected to the idea of home and other things.
That's wonderful.
That's how also we try to stay in connected with writers inside Tibet also, because it's politically it's very hard for someone like me to go back to Tibet and say, okay, where's my home and what's happening? But only other way is kind of this, intellectual things that we know about, writings from inside Tibet.
You're quite remarkable for doing that, for engaging the writings of Tibetans inside. And I know you've published, some of those works and brought those translated also into English. Is there something you would characterize, since you have read so much from inside Tibet as well? Do you see a sort of major difference between the writings in Tibet and then the writings in exile from what your reading experience?
In place like, for example, Colombia, you have creative writing classes where you are taught how to use similes and metaphors and styles like that. Now, this is in a classroom, right? But writers in Tibet, especially, like writers living under any dictator system, and moreover in Tibet, I think writers from inside Tibet had to do this. So for them, using metaphors, simile is part of their life, part of their skill. So I think that is one of the things that I find the biggest differences for writing from inside Tibet and writing in exile. We can say, for example, Dalai Lama in our stories without twice thinking that I'll have a repercussion. I can use in my stories Free Tibet or Songs and Gambo or whatever. But writers inside Tibet, they cannot do that. So they pick up other techniques, which in a in a place like this where you are taught in class, but for them that's their life. That's what they have to do. So I think because they have to do that, because that's how they survive. That's how they get through the censorship, uh, state censorship. I think their writing is many ways much more heavier and has to be read with a far more careful and consideration than writing from, say, my stories, for example. My stories can be read in many different ways, but not so much seriousness or consideration or understanding of the political and other circumstances as writers coming from inside Tibet. There's a poem in Burning the Sun's Praise by Chen Meda.
Ajahn Mehta.
Yeah, one of the foremost Tibetan poets, and he talks about this grassman. As I walk on, I turned into a grassman, without a heart, without a nervous system, without blood. On the way, I saw many other grassmen like me. They walked vacillating left and right as if without spines. Passing by a mental hospital, I saw a madman rush out of the iron gate, shouting, "Look, a grassman, a grassman." Two grassmen like me chased him inside, beating him with the sticks. Now I'm happy, just as the madman is happy not being turned into a grassman. Now, how, I would never be able to write such an absurd poem. But the fact that Chen Medak was able to do this absurd poem because he could not otherwise express himself how the circumstances, the terrible circumstances that he was undergoing. He was born under Chinese occupation, lived under Chinese occupation, and died under Chinese occupation. So people such as him, because he has to write, because he had to say that things are this absurd. So I think, so they find ways to say this with so much naturalness, with so much comfort, so much ease. Whereas I don't have that because I haven't lived, and none of us lived under that circumstances.
Let us pause right now, I think, and we'll open it up to questions. Please, everybody, join the discussion, if you would. And those people who are online as well, if you'd like to write your question in the Q&A, I can relay that to Bhuchung Sonam. And I hope you will also continue to read a couple of your works as before the evening ends. So. Yeah, Scarlett. So Nordson will have, you need to speak into the mic so that everybody can hear you online as well. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Scarlett. Actually, you mentioned Milarepa. Actually, in Lauren's class, we just learned about Milarepa. And this morning, in our student discussion, I found the student felt relatable to Milarepa's story, that there is a dark past, and then they walk onto he walked down on another path. And I feel like this sense of relation, it's really strong, and that's something a reader could get from reading something, from reading from others' writing. And you mentioned about preserving the Tibetan culture. So I was just sitting here and joining your talk, and I was thinking about your work will also be read by people who are born, like Tibetan born in the Exile, and your work will be read by these people when they felt lost, and when they felt that to look for a resonance from other, even a senior, people who are older than them. If they are, I'm sure they are. What do you feel about, when they connect to your writing? How do you feel about that? Thank you.
I feel good, I guess. Yeah, the Department of Religion and Culture of the Exile government, they organized a Tibet festival in Dharamsala. And we as in Black Neck Books, we were invited for the festival for 2 days. And there were a lot of Indian tourists, thousands of them. But when we did the maths, 80% of the books were bought by Tibetans, that also young Tibetans. So I think I was really happy, really, really happy the fact that young Tibetans buy our books. And then in Europe, for example, they have very small discussion groups where they take one of the books that we publish and then read it, and then they have discussions amongst themselves. So we have things like that. So I think it feels good to be acknowledged and to know that there are impact. Although we, as an artist, I don't write for accolade and recognition and awards and things like that. Because I write, as I said earlier, I need to write because that helps me to keep sane and rooted in who I am and do what I have to do. So I think it feels good, that young Tibetans read and have discussions, and then many years ago I went to one such discussion group, university in Delhi, and I did the worst things ever in my life. They read a poem the day before, and they had 2 hours of arguments, saying this poem means this, and the other group saying this poem means this. And the next day I was invited, and what I should have done was stay silent. I mean, who am I to give interpretation to my poems, right? That would be like religion. Religion, you have the text and somebody interprets it for you, right? Then that's where your freedom of thought ends. But art, it should have been the other way around. Who am I? I mean, like if I write a poem, as long as I don't publish it, it's mine. The moment it's the public domain, then who am I to say this poem means this only? I don't have the ownership of that. And so I think it's really nice to have young Tibetans and others kind of discuss. And also I would like to say that many of our books have been translated into other languages. Kora by Tsundu is now translated into 15 languages, and some of our books are also translated into Chinese, into Czech, and in Hindi, and also in French. So it's not only in English that we are read, but also in other languages as well.
It's recalling my class in cultural production, and when we got to the session on diaspora, 1 or 2 sessions, we played Royal Cafe and we read some writing in Exile. It actually spoke to a lot of people. It's a wide, right, the condition of being, I don't know how to say, how do you even word that, displaced, I guess, or not having that sense of a firm location or home was something that a number of people in the classroom also could relate to in different contexts, right? It might speak to why your work has been so widely translated. And then for readership, that's really, so your work is speaking in ways that you don't, to people in ways that you can't even predict necessarily, but resonating with young Tibetans, it seems. On that note, I'll just mention one thing, but Tsering Wangmo Dompa, as you know, another well-known writer, she's spoken about it's a different situation than yours, that those who are actually born in exile, she calls it longing for a home that one has never seen or been to, right? It's a bit different than your own biography, but maybe through your work, people are also able to connect. You're connecting and forming some sort of a home for people to process
also, there is all of what we are doing is based on so much hope that things will be better, that things will change. So that's the whole thing. I mean, like, if you lose hope, then it's very difficult, I think. In Tsering Yangzom Lama's award-winning novel, we measure the earth with our bodies. It's a character, Tenzin Drama, young Tibetan woman born in Nepal, but she was sent to Canada with the hope that things will be better. But of course, she realizes that sometimes hope does not knock at our door. And I often say that, happiness is a bird that does not land on the shoulder of a refugee, not yet. So.
Any questions here?
Thank you, Paulden. Could you talk a little bit more about, like, how do you see the relationship between your translation work and your own writing, like the processes that are involved in? To give a kind of personal context, when I was like, before I started translating things, I kind of refused to translate poetry or poems. And whenever especially Dejila was asking us to translate things, I would always refer them to you, because I never felt like confident or comfortable enough to translate poetry. But later on, I started also writing some things, especially during the COVID period. And then it somehow kind of loosened me into like allowing myself to translate. So could you talk about it? Yeah.
One of the things that I have never done is to translate my own writing into either from English to Tibetan or Tibetan to English, because I write I invest a lot in my writing, and when I write, I have to, in Tibetan we say lunga yesum, mind, body, and speech. So because I invest so much in writing a poem in English, right? Then the act of translation is another enterprise. It's a very different thing. So because I don't find that, initial burst or whatever energy or feeling or passion, I cannot transport that moment again. I cannot relive that moment again. So that's why I never translate my own thing from either from English or to Tibetan or other way around. But of course, I do other people's translation, two categories. One, because I have to survive. I do translation for money, payment, in which case I have only one condition: I can't do Buddhist text. I am not Buddhist scholar. I haven't studied Buddhist theory. I don't have enough insights and depth and experience into translating Buddhist philosophy or Buddhist text. So apart from Buddhist text, I translate everything from Tibetan to English and English to Tibetan. Whoever wants, I do it, as long as they pay me. Then the other translation that I do is the things that Pandey was talking about earlier, the poetry, for example. I did one anthology of poetry from inside Tibet called Burning the Sun's Braids. I put together a writing of 13 Tibetan writers living under Tibet, under China, and I selected their work because I felt that's really important. I think if you want to translate something, you really have to feel. If I read a poem in Tibetan, I have to feel at least some part of it, right? So without that feeling, then I can't translate. So that's the basic thing, that if it's a short story or an essay or a poem, I have to feel. This is one of the problems that I had with the mirror of Dandi's Mirror of Poetry. Mirror of Poetry talks about structure and style and metaphors. It doesn't address the issue of feeling. But that's what art is all about. Without feeling, without passion, without emotion, then it becomes an assembly of nice words, which when you read, it sounds really nice. But when you actually sit down and think about it, it doesn't really mean anything. So that's because I collected works by and large of third generation poets, Mirab Sumbe Nyangaba.
Why don't you define that for us? So how would you say that, third generation poets, who are you referring to?
Captain Dedril and Ray Gangling and Nyen and so this group. So I think one of the things that I like about them is they refuse to conform to any earlier writing. So they said, my generation is living now under these circumstances. So this I write because I feel, because I experience things. That's what they say. And they not only look, fairly negatively at Dandin's mirror, but also in many ways Thunup Year's poetry also. They think Langsui Babchu has too strong an influence, saying that, okay, Langsui Babchu has its own share of whatever recognition and, accolade. So that's put that aside and say, let's try to root ourselves in who we are, at our time, at our experience, at our wisdom, at our own silences. I think that's what they say. I like their writing, so I chose many of the poems to be translated. And also other more important reason is people ask, about literature that comes from inside Tibet. And I've never really seen an anthology of Tibetan writing from inside Tibet put together in one book.
That's right. Do you think there's a wide readership in Exile for the writing that's going on in Tibet? This is a bit new to me. I didn't realize. Do you think it's become influential?
Yes,
or-
very much, I think. Because Burning the Sun's Parades, we did 2 reprints already.
Wow.
And many of the readers are Tibetan. And they are they really like it. And many people actually, more people came to me talking about that translated book than my own stuff. People will say, okay, you translated this poem, I was really inspired. Where can I find more of Red Kangling's poem, for example, or Thevrang's poem, for example? So I think it's very encouraging that only thing is they don't have the access to the literature from inside Tibet. It's sometimes hard to get, and especially in a book form. So you have to kind of pick one from here, another from there, another from there. So
And you're talking about translations, and also not in English, right? There's not very much in English.
yeah, not.
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
we have a lot of Buddhist text now translated into English, but when we are talking about Tibetan literature, I think not much.
So are you, I just call out Journal of Tibetan Literature online. Yeshe is another online magazine that publishes. And Tibet Writes, are you also including the literature that's being published in Tibet, the translations of that? And and like to ask you too, how has Tibet Writes, now that it's gone for 20 years, how have you seen Tibetan writing, but in exile, or the exchange within Tibet change over those 20 years? Have you seen any certain developments that you would
Yes, I
identify?
think quality has certainly gone up. Definitely, that's because we have now education system is much better. Children have more access to other things, other languages, and also, when I was in school, the school library had one almirah, which was locked always with the precious books, and then there were 2 bookshelves. That's all we had. Just 2 bookshelves and one almirah. That's all we had. So now, of course, children have so much access to so many different kind of books, including the ones that we publish. So I think, and we have more younger writers. Last year we published books, and one of the writers is only 23 years old. He has written a novel in Tibetan, murder mystery, for the first time.
Oh, could you say the
So-
name of the writer?
Tenzin Seba.
Okay.
I'll text you the
Tenzin Sepa. So
Tenzin
in
Seba.
exile,
Tenzin
has
Seba
written
is
a
a
novel.
murder
Fantastic.
mystery, a novel written by a very young Tibetan, 23 years old, and we published it. And so it's very encouraging. He was born in exile, educated in exile, only 23 years old, and writing a novel, murder mystery in Tibetan that we published. So we are seeing all this different. Not only the quality has gone up, but also the variety of writing has also gone up. From earlier, we used to write about all about loneliness and sadness. Exile. I mean, exile. Although it's a difficult time, but also in many ways it's a celebration of success that we haven't died yet. We are surviving and thriving. So it's a good sign.
Yeah. No, we see a lot of creativity among this younger generation, right? Yeah. Not, um, questions? Great, Deepak. And I'm concerned that people online may be not able to, if you're online, someone just put a question into the Q&A. Are you able to access that? Thank you. Or a hello. Yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, firstly, I must say that Bhuchung La's poetry is a window into the exile experience. And today, when the discussion started, the initial reading that you did from the book 20 years ago, you'd mentioned at that point, and that's what got me thinking, that you'd said it's been over 20 years since I've read this passage again. If you were to write a similar introduction to a similar book today, 20 years later, would the content of what you say be very different? I mean, what I'm getting at is, has your experience of being an exile over the last 20 years, has it been different from at the time you wrote this book? And if it is, I mean, how would you put that into words?
Thank you. Good question.
Very good question. Very hard one also. How do I respond to that? No, I did another anthology, Under the Blue Skies, last maybe a couple of years ago. And because I put it together, I had to write an introduction, and the question, some of the questions are still the same, because despite that we are far more economically better off, we have far more access to other things, but fundamentally, politically, our situation hasn't changed. And in the last many decades, we haven't made any headways in terms of, negotiating with China in terms of bringing a solution to the conflict. So given that basic framework, and also given the fact that when I was writing, putting together Musicians Exile, we still have fairly large number of Tibetans living in India, Nepal, and Bhutan. But now I think it's almost like 50-50 maybe. So Tibetans from Bhutan, Nepal, Bhutan, and India have moved out since then in large numbers. And this has a fundamental impact, because when His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama came into exile, he set up these institutions, Tibetan Institute of Performing Arts, Sarnath, higher studies for Tibetans, monasteries, and other schools. So these has played really important role in making us a cohesive society, and also maintaining our culture and language and other things. Now we have more Tibetans living outside of that system. So the impact will be really huge. And some of the questions that I raised in the introduction was, how is it that a young Tibetan living in Canada, for example, not speaking Tibetan, not knowing Tibetan language, not knowing Tibetan culture, how does she express herself, or identify herself, or root herself as a Tibetan? So will her worldview and expression change simply because she doesn't have a Tibetan language? How will her expression, without any Tibetan background, so how does that shape not only her but also other people who are, that line? So if that is the case with this generation, then we have Tibetans who were born in Tibet, came into exile to Nepal, lived for a few years in Nepal, and then lived for a few years in India, then came to Canada or US. So for those people, they were living at least 3-4 different cultures and different languages and different political set of political systems. So it's a very complex thing, and some of the questions that we have to ask, but may never find answers. Sorry, I don't know if that answers your question, but
For those younger people, do you have advice on that? People who maybe don't feel so secure in the language, or, I mean, do you want to venture to answer your own question or to make a suggestion for younger creatives, younger generation creatives?
Yeah, I think one of the things that they have to do is to read, because we have come to a state where the visual has taken so much of time, space, and energy that we don't really, we have 2 ears, right, on two sides, right? We only have one mouth and two eyes only looking at one side, but now ears are basically rendered far less important than it should. Because when a child in stomach, maybe 3-4 weeks, they can hear things. They can see only when they are born. So naturally, your ears are far more important than your eyes, I think. So I think under such circumstances, it's really important to read. And one of the things that because also our publication proportion is 70% in English and 30% in Tibetan. This decision is because we realize the fact that we will have increasingly more number of Tibetans who may not speak Tibetan, but they will read one way or another. And if they read, they might as well have something to read about Tibet, something to do with the Tibet, whether it's a story or a book or poem or anything.
Yeah.
So I think, so I think they should read and be honest with yourself. There's so much assumption and preconceived idea about Tibet, and some of it also comes from us. The fact that we lived in Tibet had been a peaceful country for thousands of years, all of that. I think we have to make sure that we are honest with ourselves, accept the fact that we are complex, confused, and not 100%, perfect. Except that our history is complicated. We have ups and downs. We can't always say, oh, everything is nice. Tibetan community is the most successful, and we have the, flawless democratic system and all of that. So it's really good. It's successful. But I think to be honest, it's important, because everything starts with honesty. At least that's what I believe.
You've used the word hope a lot today. Where do you draw a source of hope, I guess, going forward?
I mean, the life itself, I think if you leave, then, and also coming from a culture that I come from and many of us come from, I think for us, self as an individual is not the center of the world. We are part of our family, part of the community, part of a larger society, and part of the world. So that's how we try to think ourselves as. If that is the case, then what you do has to have a positive impact, not only to yourself, to your family. And so I think when you have a way of life where self is kind of put at the center and say, everything has to be for me, what is in it for me, then I think you have a problem, I think. So I don't know where I'm going, but
Sorry, yeah.
There are questions.
So I think I have a very similar question. There are actually two things that I've been thinking about. One is language, and I have lots of feelings and thoughts about that. And the other one is a sense of home. And I think that's an emerging theme in many of Tibetan writers, artists, filmmakers, and thinkers' work. And the idea of home, I know Instant is nowhere to call home, I think has this really powerful quote about just home as something that is imagined, and also home as something that doesn't really have a place, right? So the way I think about home, I think it's in some ways resonating to a much larger audience than exiled Tibetans, partly because we live in a world that is constantly in flux, change, migration. And I feel like migration has become such a pivotal part of everyone's life, regardless of where you were born, what language you speak. And it's pretty much part of everyone's existence due to climate change, displacement, employment. I mean, there's just so many factors that I can think of. And, you know, when we conceptualize this idea of home, and I think it comes sort of natural to Tibetans because we're displaced and we're constantly thinking about this concept. Maybe there are so many thousands of people out there who are also feeling the feeling that you're feeling, that feeling that Sundula is feeling or Dasila feeling, but doesn't really have the language or doesn't really have the opportunity to express in the way that we do, right? So in some ways, I see that as an asset for the Tibetans because we, in some ways, like for practical purposes, we have to think about it because it's in front of us. But for some people, it looks like it's distance, but I think it is a big question for a lot of people on this planet because of migration, because of displacement, because of movements between one state to another, even if it's not between countries, but like states. So yeah, the idea of home, does it have to have a place is a question in my head. And then the other comment about language, I worry about that a lot because I know the Tibetan schools, the TCV schools that His Holiness established helped us maintain and preserve the language for the last 60 years. Now we're in places like the US and Canada, and there are children who are now born and raised here. And so many of them do not speak Tibetan or read Tibetan. And that's the reality. And many of them, when you ask them, where are you from? They're like, I'm from New York or US. But when Tibetans in India, when we ask them, they're like, oh, it's more complicated. I have more history to tell you. But the Tibetans who are born here are not really interested in explaining where they are from because they have this house that they can sort of think about and this place that they grew up in. So I sometimes worry about the concern that you addressed initially about language, right? I have to write in English to survive. And so I can't help but think about like a dark future. So, and so I guess, where do you find the hope for Tibetans who are trying to preserve so badly, you know, the little that we have left? And how can we cultivate more hope in our community? And to answer my question, I feel like it really boils down to art and film and the things that you are doing, which is incredible. But I guess, do you have some tangible advice or thoughts around gaining more hope for the Tibetans in New York, in Canada, in Europe? How do we survive in the next 50 years? That's my question. How can we preserve the language and the knowledge and the culture? Because the younger generation seems to feel like they're American or they're Canadian or European. I mean, I'm making a full generalization here. Not everyone feels that way, but that's the sort of sentiment that I get.
Yeah, that language I think is really important because, Tibetan written script was devised in the 7th century, so it's been over 1300 years. And along with that, Buddhism was introduced to Tibet. So Buddhism, introduction to Buddhism and Tibetan language, the written script came together. So that's why I think we have huge corpus of Buddhist literature translated for thousands of years. And that's one part of it. But more importantly, I think Tibet is a very ancient civilization. In 2022, they found rock art in Tilung, not very far from Lhasa. And I think it goes back to over 2 million years old. So that human civilization has been there since that long. So we have really long lineage of culture both Buddhist and otherwise. And much of it is in the language itself. So when we lose the language, we lose the essence of it. Like, for example, how do we preserve nomadic culture? Much of it is not written in text, very oral. So when we lose the language, we lose everything else. So that is really important. So I think for young generation, I think language is important, but I think also you can't really solely blame on them. The circumstances that we had choice, but we made the choice. The fact that we were forced out of Tibet by the Chinese occupation, but nobody forced us out of Indian subcontinent into the Western countries. We made the conscious decision by ourselves. So I think it's time for whoever is in a position to make larger decisions. I think it's important that also the population proportion is now 50-50. So the more focus has to be paid to Tibetans living here in New York or in Toronto. I think I've heard that there are at least 15,000 here. Yeah, maybe even more. So Dharamsala has the maximum number of Tibetans in India, about 9,000. So for the last 50 or so years, focus has been on India, Nepal, and Bhutan, the expenses and policies and everything else. So I think, but this decision, you and I don't have the power to make. The other important thing is, I think it's also up to individual family. Language is very, has to do with the human connection. You can't really teach in a weekend school. You could, you can introduce somebody to Kaka Kanga, right? But if the language comes as a part of your life, then that becomes your mother tongue. That becomes important. So I think, I've seen many families here in the US. I can sense that mom and dad's English is not that great, but still they speak English to their children. So I don't know why, but that's what is happening here. So I think that it has so many different elements to this. So it's hard to say, okay, if you do this, then culture is ensured or the language is ensured. All of the people who have stake have to make, I think, difficult decisions, hard decisions. I'm speaking like a diplomat now.
You mentioned half of the population, if half is outside, half now in, I guess you'd say South Asia maybe, but also remind ourselves that there's, still 6 million Tibetans in Tibet. So I think one of the beautiful thing that your work offers is connecting people outside to, the homeland still, through your translation and through, bringing those, there was, with WeChat at least, there was a lot more discussion going on, and just that's one thing. And I also think about culture being culture in action. So we see these there's a lot of young Tibetans in New York doing really cool things, engaging each other and, creating online stuff. So, it's not my place to even say, but just doing something, joining up. Chimmy, you founded this incredible organization, Yindi, and I think in that there's seems to be a lot of hope in that, and not just hope, but actual creating together, doing things together, which keeps things alive. However good or not one's language is, it's still community, but
Something positive is happening, I think, in terms of art. The Sri Yangzom Lama has published a novel which won awards, and also recently Tenzin Rigdel's solo exhibition is going at the Met. And also there's a Tibetan filmmakers collective in Dharamsala. They made a film, an anthology of films, 4 films, which got selected to be premiered at the Busan International Film Festival. So it's kind of happening slowly, I think. And then we have Tibetan artist collective in Dharamsala called Kato, is the color. So they're also preparing an exhibition featuring about more than 20 exile artists. So all of these are happening, So I think it's good that we have dialogues, intellectual dialogues in the form of art, which crosses many boundaries in culture, not only limiting to Tibetan psychological scape and space, but also I think reflects our stories, but opening the door to many other societies and communities. So it's happening, but we also have to make sure that the negative side is also focused.
Could you read one last poem for us in closing? Or one
Yeah, I
last
will.
one? Would that be
normally-
nice, right? One last piece. Okay, thank you. And we are
Yeah.
actually almost at time, so.
All my movements belong to you, and I'm lonely still, enveloped in the smoke of your shadow, like a dandelion under a tree. My head swells with your thoughts, and my heart is empty still, left behind by your pack of mares like a hoofless donkey. You are a spotless distant moon. I am a pebble on the shore, waiting for the next wave bathed in your light. I am no more than a fallen leaf, a feather stuck on a juniper tree, but I circle you all until stars outshine the moon. In search of your warmth, I follow the path of a vulture's flight, and my sparrow's wings take me to the desolate corner of my room. Here, I stare into the dusty screen of my laptop, hoping to write a song about the breeze that brings your fragrance. So I once again would like to thank Lauran and my friend Pandengel for putting this event together, and all my friends for coming. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. And we really appreciate your joining us. And I also would like to say, I feel you're recalling the tradition of memory and recitation. I love that, which I think has deep roots in Tibetan culture. So that is certainly continuing. Yes, thank you to Padingya. You really did do a lot of work in pulling all this together. I really appreciate that. We appreciate the Weatherhead East Asian Institute for its funding. And we hope to see you back again on October 25th for a discussion of journalism in the diaspora. Thank you.